For 2 agonizing weeks, the brutal summer sun had baked the valley into cracked, dead clay, but instead of seeking the shade, Ren Castille's 3 water buffalo marched to the exact same barren corner of her lower pasture every morning, lowered their massive heads, and tore at the dirt with their hooves as though something beneath that hard ground mattered more than the heat, the empty stock tank, or the last scraps of grass disappearing around them. Ren had watched them do it until the strange routine began to feel like another problem she couldn't afford, especially because the bank was already waiting on her next payment, and the old well that kept her 76-acre farm alive was pumping less water every week. Her wealthy neighbor, Martinvale, finally stopped at the fence one morning and laughed when he saw the animals digging, telling her that if she was now letting Buffalo decide where to look for water, she might as well start packing. Ren wanted to dismiss him, but she had spent enough years around animals to know that they rarely wasted precious energy without a reason, and on the 15th morning, when she finally walked down into the pasture to see what had kept bringing them back, she placed her hand against the dirt beneath their crater and felt something that made her forget the heat entirely. The ground was cold. Ren stayed crouched there with her palm pressed against the soil, trying to convince herself that there had to be an ordinary explanation. The pasture around her was baking at close to 105 degrees. Nothing about ground that hot had any business feeling like this, 6 inches down, cool enough that she pulled her hand back once just to check it wasn't her imagination. She pushed an old steel fence rod into the loosened dirt and worked it down as far as it would go. When she drew it back out, the bottom 2 feet came up dark and faintly damp, in a summer that hadn't produced a real rain in over 5 weeks. What that cold, damp patch of ground was actually hiding, and why a company that had gone out of business before Ren was even born still believed it had a legal claim to whatever was down there, would take a barn nearly collapsing, an old note in her father-in-law's handwriting, and a records office clerk with more patience than most, before Ren understood any of it. As you watch, see if you can work out what the buffalo were really after, because it wasn't water, and it wasn't the first time this land had gone through exactly this before. Ren had run Castille Water Buffalo Dairy alone for 2 years, since her husband Danny died in a highway accident 3 counties over, leaving her a 76-acre farm, a 12-year-old daughter, and alone his own family had never quite believed she could manage without him standing beside her. She bought the buffalo herself, against most of the advice anyone offered, because they held condition on rough forage and tolerated heat that would have broken the beef herd Danny's father had run for 30 years before handing the place down. It made sense to her, the arithmetic of an animal built for exactly the kind of hard, thin land she'd inherited. It had never once made sense to anyone else in the county. Her daughter Lila noticed things Ren tried hard to keep from her. The way Ren had stopped mentioning the barn roof that needed patching, the particular silence that settled over the kitchen table whenever the mail brought something from the bank with a window envelope. She was 12, not stupid, and she'd stopped asking her mother if everything was okay months ago, mostly because the answer never changed anything either way. Danny's father, Walter, had died 3 years before Danny himself, leaving behind a filing cabinet nobody had fully sorted through. Deeds, tax records, receipts going back decades. None of it anything Ren had needed to understand until the summer the buffalo started digging. Lila started helping with the digging almost by accident, drawn out to the pasture one evening by nothing more than curiosity about why her mother kept walking down there after chores were done. She was the one who first noticed that the buffalo didn't dig randomly within the crater. They worked one specific quadrant of it, morning after morning, ignoring the rest of the loosened earth entirely. They're not just digging, Mom. Look, they keep going back to the same corner of the hole, not just anywhere in it. Ren hadn't noticed that detail herself, 3 weeks into watching the same animals do the same thing, and it unsettled her a little that her daughter had caught it before she had. She started marking the corner Lila pointed out with a stake, and sure enough, every subsequent morning, that was where the herd concentrated first before spreading out to the rest of the crater. It became something the two of them did together most evenings after that. Not quite a project, not quite a distraction from everything else pressing in on the farm. Just 20 minutes at the fence line watching animals work a patch of ground neither of them yet understood. Lila keeping a small notebook of her own where she wrote down which buffalo dug where and for how long. Numbers Ren would end up grateful for weeks later when the soil chemist asked how consistent the pattern had actually Bin. Martinvale owned close to 4,000 acres scattered across the county, most of it leased out to citrus operations and a growing cattle interest, and he'd been trying to buy Ren's 76 acres for the better part of 2 years, always framing it as a kindness rather than the acquisition it actually was. He caught her at the fence line that first week of the digging, leaning against his truck with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once had to do the math Ren did most nights lying awake. Run. He nodded toward the buffalo, heads down, working the same crater they'd worked the day before. You letting your livestock pick your well sites now? They're not picking anything, Martin. They're just animals in a drought. Sure looks like more than that from here. He said it easily, not unkindly exactly, which somehow made it land worse than if he'd meant to be cruel. My offer's still good. Better than good, given where this county's headed this summer. You don't have to keep doing this alone. I'm not selling. He shrugged, the way a man shrugs when he's confident time is doing his arguing for him, and drove off without pushing further that day. She went back down to the crater that evening after he'd gone, expecting to find nothing more than 3 tired animals and a hole neither useful nor explainable. What she found instead, cold ground where the whole valley was baking, damp soil in a summer bone dry for weeks, sat with her the rest of that night in a way she couldn't quite shake. She didn't call anyone the next morning. She went back out at dawn instead, dug a little deeper by hand, and watched the buffalo return to the exact same spot within the hour, working the loosened dirt with a patience that had stopped looking like restlessness days earlier and started looking, unmistakably, like purpose. It took her most of a week to work up the nerve to call Eli Mercer, an excavation contractor in his 70s who'd known Walter Castille most of his life and had put more holes in the ground across that county than anyone still living. He'd dug the original well on this same property back in the 80s, Ren remembered Danny mentioning once, and had done small jobs for Walter on and off for decades after that, the kind of long, unhurried relationship that outlasts most formal business arrangements. Eli walked the site slowly the following Saturday, crouched at the edge of the crater, and didn't promise her anything before he'd actually had a proper look. He was quiet a long moment, running a hand along the exposed dirt wall, before he said anything at all. Walter ever mention anything strange about this corner of the property to you? No. What? No reason yet. Just an old feeling. He didn't explain further, working a soil probe down at a few points around the hole, rolling the cores between calloused fingers. Buffalo find damp ground sometimes, he finally said. Don't mean there's a fortune under it. Don't mean there's anything down there worth the trouble of finding out, half the time. He straightened up slowly, one hand pressed against his lower back. Do it small, he told her. Do it cheap. Don't let hope talk you into a hole you can't climb back out of. They dug a modest test pit rather than anything larger, hand tools, and a rented mini excavator for a single afternoon instead of the kind of drilling rig Ren couldn't have afforded regardless. At around 7 feet, the soil went dark. At 9, water began seeping steadily through the walls of the pit, gathering slow and clear at the bottom. It wasn't enough to save the farm on its own. Eli was honest about that from the first hour, the flow modest, the kind of pocket that might hold or might quit within a season, no way to know yet which. But it was more than Ren had expected from a summer that had given her nothing so far, but bad news arriving on schedule. Martin heard about the test pit within days. Word moved fast in a county that size, and drove out himself to see it, standing at the lip of the hole with his hands in his pockets, looking down at water pooling slow and dark at the bottom. You found mud, he said, not quite laughing this time, something more careful in his voice than the mockery from 2 weeks earlier. Eli says it might hold. Might not. Too soon to say. Sure. Martin crouched at the edge, studying the water with an attention that seemed disproportionate for a man who claimed to think it was nothing. Then he made her a new offer. Higher than the last one. High enough that it should have felt like validation, and instead felt like exactly the opposite. Why would you pay that much for ground you spent 2 weeks telling me was worthless? Ren asked. Martin didn't answer that directly. He told her, almost as an afterthought climbing back into his truck, that she ought to be careful about disturbing something that might not fully belong to her, and left before she could ask what that was supposed to mean. Ren spent that evening doing something she hadn't thought to try before, pulling up the county's public property records on her laptop at the kitchen table and searching Martin's company name against every parcel purchase filed in the last 3 years. What she found unsettled her more than the vague warning had. Martin's company had quietly acquired mineral and subsurface interests on 4 other properties scattered around the county over the past 2 years, none of them large land purchases, all of them specifically limited to whatever sat beneath the surface, all of them, as far as she could tell from the filing descriptions, connected somehow to old phosphate-era claims similar to whatever he'd been hinting at about her own land. He wasn't just guessing that something valuable might be under her pasture. He'd been building toward this for a while, quietly, on more properties than just hers. She noticed the second half of the mystery 3 days later, standing at the edge of the pit at dusk, watching the buffalo work. They weren't drinking the water pooled at the bottom. They were pushing their noses past it, into the wet clay along the walls, working it with a focus that had nothing to do with thirst. She scooped a sample of that clay into a mason jar the next morning, Lila's notebook of digging patterns tucked in beside it, and drove both 2 counties over to a soil chemist named Beverly Okafor, who ran a small lab out of a converted warehouse and had a reputation, according to the neighbor who'd recommended her, for actually returning phone calls. Beverly looked over Lila's notebook longer than Ren expected before she said anything about the clay sample itself. "Your daughter did this. She's been keeping track most evenings. I didn't think it'd matter much. It matters plenty. Consistent behavior over this many days, same location, same species doing it independently. That's not random foraging. That's targeted." Beverly ran the sample through testing that took the better part of an hour, Ren and Lila waiting in a small front office that smelled like coffee and old paper, until Beverly came back out holding a printout. The results described mineral concentrations well above anything typical for that region. Calcium, sodium, trace minerals in a combination Beverly's note called notably rich, borderline unusual for this soil type. Ren called Eli that same afternoon on the drive home, and he wasn't surprised by it in the way she expected. "Water buffalo do that," he said. "Seek out mineral clay on purpose, not for thirst, for the minerals themselves. Domesticated animals mostly lose the instinct over generations of easy feed. Yours clearly haven't." They hadn't been digging for water at all. The water had simply been sitting on top of what they actually wanted. The real trouble arrived the same week, on a morning Ren would spend a long time afterward wishing she could take back. A delivery truck bringing lumber for the barn repair pulled in heavier than the ground near the old foundation could apparently hold, and by the time Ren heard the specific groaning sound that made her stomach drop, a deep, structural creak entirely different from anything the old barn normally made settling in the heat. A whole section of earth near the barn's east support had slumped several inches overnight, the post above it leaning at an angle that hadn't been there the evening before. She called Eli before she'd even finished her coffee, voice tighter than she wanted it to be, and he was there within 20 minutes, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to across uneven ground still soft from where it had given way. They spent a genuinely frightening morning together confirming the barn itself wasn't about to follow the ground down after it. Working fast with temporary shoring lumber Eli kept in the bed of his truck for exactly this kind of emergency, Ren's hands shaking badly enough at one point that she had trouble holding a brace steady while Eli drove the bolts through. "Ground's not stable under that whole corner," Eli said finally, once the immediate danger had passed, and they both stood back to look at the shoring holding. "Test pit probably loosened more of the surrounding soil than either of us accounted for. You're going to need this done properly, Ren. Not held together with 2x4s and hope. Stabilizing it properly cost $4,000 she didn't have room to spend, pulled straight from the account she'd been protecting specifically for the bank payment now 6 weeks out, and closing fast. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the stabilization invoice and the loan statement side by side, doing math that came out badly no matter how she rearranged it, closer to calling Martin back than she'd admit to anyone afterward. "You don't have to fix everything at once, Mom," Lila said, sitting across from her with her own homework spread out, not looking up right away. "Dad didn't leave us this place because it was easy. Grandpa Walter used to say he left it because he thought it was worth taking care of. Those aren't the same thing." Ren didn't have a ready answer for that. She reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's for a long moment before going back to the numbers, and something in her had settled a little by the time she finally went to bed. The second document came from the same filing cabinet the following week, folded inside an old ledger Ren hadn't gotten to yet, A short note in Walter's own cramped handwriting, dated 1978, tucked between ordinary entries about cattle weights and feed costs. Found the clay seam down in the low corner this dry year. Didn't develop it. Some things you don't touch unless the land's actually asking you to. Ren read it twice, sitting on the floor of the barn loft with dust settling around her, understanding slowly that it wasn't a warning to leave the ground alone forever. It was a condition, a line drawn not against ever using what was down there, but against using it carelessly, before the farm genuinely needed it. Walter had known about this exact patch of ground for over 40 years and chosen, every season until his death, that the land hadn't asked hard enough yet to justify disturbing it. This year it clearly had. Martin's warning about ownership sent Ren to the county records office the following Monday, driving in with a knot in her stomach she hadn't fully shaken since he'd said it. A patient clerk named Doris helped her pull everything connected to the property's original deed history, working through microfilm and yellowed physical files with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd clearly done this 1,000 times before. Buried in a folder Doris hadn't opened in years herself was a 1953 mineral and subsurface rights conveyance. Walter's own father having sold off everything beneath the surface of a section of the property, water, clay, minerals, all of it, to an outfit called Consolidated Phosphate and Chemical Company, for a sum that read, even generously adjusted for the decades since, almost insultingly small. Ren sat with the photocopy in her hands a long moment, feeling something cold settle in her chest despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. 70 years, and her own family had apparently sold away rights to their own ground, without anyone since ever mentioning it existed. Company like that, Doris said, squinting at the old filing stamp, would have been common enough back then. Phosphate boom brought a lot of speculative buyers through this county, bought up subsurface rights cheap on the theory they'd strike something big eventually. Most of them folded within a decade or two when the easy deposits ran out. Is this still active? This deed? Can he actually do anything with it? Doris didn't know offhand, which was itself useful information delivered gently rather than as a dismissal, and pointed Ren toward the state's mineral rights statutes instead of guessing at something she wasn't certain of. Won't do you any good if I tell you something wrong and you build your whole plan on it, she said. Go read the actual law. I'll help you find the right shelf. What Ren found there, over several evenings of reading language considerably drier than anything she was used to, curled up at the kitchen table with Lila doing homework across from her, did more to settle her nerves than anything else had in a month. Florida, like a number of states, kept a dormant mineral rights statute on the books, a law providing that a severed subsurface interest left entirely unused for a set number of years reverted automatically back to the surface owner, no court fight required, provided nobody connected to the original claim had worked it, filed on it, or even formally referenced it in the interim. Consolidated Phosphate and Chemical Company had gone out of business sometime in the early 1960s, according to state corporate records Ren found with a different clerk's help the following week. There was no record anywhere in the county files of the claim being worked, tested, or so much as mentioned again after the original 1953 deed itself. Martin's company, it turned out, Ren pieced this together from public filings and one unhelpfully vague conversation with his office assistant, had purchased a bundle of old dormant mineral claims from a holding company 2 years earlier, which had in turn acquired them from whatever remained of the original phosphate outfit's dissolved assets decades after it folded. A long chain of paper sales, apparently, that nobody along the way had bothered checking against the actual statute governing whether the underlying claim was still legally alive at all. Ren hired a lawyer with money she genuinely didn't have room to spare, a young woman named Priya Anand who worked mostly out of a strip mall office 2 towns over, and didn't charge Ren for the first consultation once she heard the shape of the story. The answer that came back 3 weeks later was about as close to unambiguous as legal answers ever get. The subsurface claim beneath Ren's pasture had lapsed decades before Martin's company ever purchased it secondhand. Whatever they believed they owned, they didn't, and hadn't for most of Ren's own lifetime. Martin didn't come to the gate with his hat in his hand. His own lawyers confirmed the statute held within the week, once Priya sent over the documentation, and the last real conversation Ren had with him about any of it was short, professional, and entirely without warmth. You got lucky on the paperwork, he said, standing at the same fence line where he'd once told her to start packing. Maybe, Ren said. Or maybe your company should have checked what it was actually buying before it tried to buy my farm out from under a claim that already died before I was born. He didn't have much to offer in response to that, and he didn't apologize for 2 years of offers dressed up as favors, or for the warning that had genuinely frightened her more than the leaning barn post had, that same difficult week. He simply left, and Ren understood, watching his truck pull off down the county road, that this was likely the closest thing to an ending she was going to get from him directly. The clay didn't make Ren wealthy. It made her something steadier and considerably more believable. A modest supply contract with a livestock mineral supplement company 2 counties over, small but dependable, enough on its own to cover what the barn repair had cost her and leave a genuine cushion besides for the first time in 2 years. She fixed the roof she'd been quietly ignoring since the previous fall. She made the bank payment with time to spare, the loan officer's voice noticeably warmer on that particular phone call than it had been on any call before it. Martin's company came back once more that autumn, not for the land this time. A junior representative called ahead, considerably more polite than Martin himself had ever managed to be, requesting temporary equipment access across a corner of Ren's property to test another old dormant claim 2 parcels over, a route his crew apparently found more convenient than the alternative. You don't owe him anything, Lila said, when Ren mentioned the call over dinner that night. After everything he said to you. I don't owe him a favor, Ren agreed. That's different from owing him fairness. Those aren't the same thing either. She thought about it a moment longer, watching her daughter turn that distinction over the way Lila turned most things over lately, more thoughtful at 12 than Ren herself had probably been at twice that age. Your dad used to say you can tell more about a person by how they treat someone who's already lost than by how they treat someone who beat them. I'd rather be the first kind. She asked Priya what a fair access rate actually looked like for that kind of temporary crossing, charged Martin's company exactly that and not $1 more, and let the crew through without making either side sit through an apology neither one particularly wanted to give. A neighbor stopped by that fall, the way neighbors eventually do once a story's made its way fully around a county that size, and asked Ren the question everyone got around to asking sooner or later, how she'd known there was anything worth finding under that dead corner of pasture. Ren looked out across the field, where junipers stood ankle-deep in the shallow pool that had never fully dried back up since that first test pit, working her nose slowly through mineral clay at the water's edge the same unhurried way she had the very first week Ren ever noticed her digging. Lila sat on the fence rail nearby, notebook open on her knee out of habit now more than necessity, still tracking which buffalo worked which section of ground on any given evening. I didn't, Ren said. She did. The ground everyone in the county had once considered worthless was green now at the edges, water standing quiet where cracked, dead clay used to be, and 3 water buffalo still worked that same corner most afternoons. Not because anyone told them to, and not because there was anything left down there that Ren didn't already understand, but simply because it had never stopped being exactly what they'd known it was the whole time, long before anyone with a deed or a law degree caught up to them. If a story like this, where paying attention to what the animals already knew turns out to matter more than any amount of money thrown at the problem, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever trusted an instinct nobody else around you took seriously, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.